So today we'll be looking at GitHub Codespaces. So I'm Trogh. I'm a developer engagement lead at Microsoft. I'm based in Belgium. And so you can find me on Twitter. Maybe just a quick slide before we dive into lots of demos. So first, why do we have GitHub Codespaces? And then more in general, kind of what is a typical developer workflow? Because GitHub Codespaces really fits into one of the areas of the developer workflow. And so as you start developing software, you go to like 6 typical steps, where the first one is really setting up your local development environment, making sure you have all the tools, you have all the frameworks, libraries, all that set up. You configure whatever you need to configure in terms of frameworks and tooling before you actually start developing and writing your code. And so, yeah, development is typically the kind of the phase where you'll be focusing most of your time on, and as well as testing. And then you start integrating all of the different components of your application. Maybe you'll do some optimization before you go into actually deploying, pushing your code and your application into a production environment, or could be test environment as well. And so what you want to do is really whatever you can optimize in this workflow really gives you more time, saves you money, to basically focus your time on the things that you like most. And as a developer, typically it's writing code. And so when we look at GitHub Codespaces is really in that first part, in setting up your local development environment and also writing your code. And so what exactly is GitHub Codespaces? So Codespaces is what we call an online development environment. So everything is, as you may guess, it's hosted by GitHub, and it is powered by Visual Studio Code. And so what you get with GitHub Codespaces is really a cloud hosted development environment. So your development environment, so your Visual Studio Code, will be running 100% in your browser. Potentially, you could actually customize it so that it actually matches the specific code that you are having in your repository. So your GitHub Codespace actually is part of your code repository on GitHub. And why is that important? Actually, your GitHub Codespace defines what your development environment will look like. And as it is part of your repository, whoever actually joins your repository as a new team member or as an open source contributor, that's kind of a nice extension of the discussion we had earlier. So if you want to contribute to an open source project and it has an associated GitHub Codespace with it, actually all of the setup, all of the configuration for that open source project is included in that GitHub Codespace, which means that if you start that Codespace, you will get all of the configuration. You'll be set to actually start contributing and writing code straight from the get-go. So that's really cool. So you don't need to bother, because that's kind of the typical steps when you start working on an open source project, is really going through the documentation and looking at, well, how do I actually get this stuff going? What are kind of the first steps to build this project and actually to run the project? And so we include all of that in GitHub Codespaces. And kind of the advantage, of course, of having it in the browser, having it cloud hosted in GitHub and hosted in the cloud, it actually allows you to develop from everywhere you are. You just connect to it using your browser and you're set to go. So rather than going to a whole slide deck, what we'll do is we'll just go to a demo of GitHub Codespaces. And so let me first switch to how do you get, because Codespaces currently is still in a beta, and so you have a waitlist for you to get started with Codespaces. And so here, if you go to this link, and I've shared it also, I'll share it also in the presentation. You can actually get signed up to that waitlist. It may take some time, and it has taken some time already for people to kind of get added to the waitlist. There's a huge amount of people that want to join, so just have some patience there. Now, how does it actually work? So I have here a sample repository. It's just a kind of a static web application. So it has some front-end code written in Vue.js. I have some backend APIs which are running on Azure Functions. And so what we want to do here is we want to get started with this open source project. And what is cool is here in my repository, if I want to get started with GitHub Codespaces, the only thing I need to do here is click on the code button. And there it has a little link which says open with Codespaces. So I can click here as well. And so it says, well, I have no active Codespaces. So I can create a new one. Or if you click on these three dots here, you can actually create a custom Codespace. What is kind of custom on it? It's basically that you can specify what machine type you want to have for running your application. Okay, so yeah. In the meantime, I'm keeping an eye on the questions there. So Codespaces, a question here from Steven is it working also with Azure DevOps? So actually, Codespaces is currently only working with GitHub, as it was mentioned also by Christoph. Yeah, and Visual Studio Online isn't it deprecated? Well, Visual Studio Online came actually. Is there a problem with the stream? Potentially, yes. So what we'll do, I'll just continue for the recording. And so what we'll do is we'll just create a new workspace here. So as we do this, what will happen is behind the scenes, a new cloud-based environment, developer environment, is going to be spun up. And so what you'll see here is we're preparing our Codespace. So it takes a little bit of time. So it takes kind of 20, 30 seconds for the Codespace to be up and running. And I'll check my network connection. We should be fine. This is taking a little bit longer than it should be, and looking at the live stream there, people seem to be having problems with the connection. Okay, so in the meantime, I'll continue. Okay, so what we have right here is, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can actually see what's happening here. So what you see here is actually the browser environment.
Nick?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we is it back to live or is it just me?
Let me check.
Okay, let you continue then.
Okay. Yeah, let me see. I hope we can still continue here. Okay. So what we did is in our repository, we clicked on actually the code button and we created a Codespace. Yes, maybe I should quickly come back here. Okay. To show you actually what I did. So in our repository, what we do is on this code button, we can actually click on Open with Codespaces, and we can open the one that I just created. And what happens is it will open up our developer environment in our browser with all of the code that we have in our repository ready for us to kind of develop with. Okay, so it's connecting now. Should take just a few seconds. Here it's coming up. And so what you'll see here is what you would see in your regular Visual Studio Code as you would run it on your laptop. Here it's actually running in the browser. So we have our file section. You can see that we have all of our source control items here. We can go and run and debug our application. Also, we have all of our extensions. So all of the extensions that you have in VS Code on your local machine are actually also available here when running in Codespaces. Okay, so this is pretty cool. So in here, what we have is also our terminal window. So what we can do here, if we want to run this application, so let's say I want to run our API, go to the API folder in Azure Functions, and I do an npm install. I want to get all the dependencies. So it's installed all of the dependencies, and then I do an npm start. Okay, so lo and behold, we have an issue here. You can see that the actual command line is not available. Why is that? Because, well, we just open up our code space. It doesn't know that we are using Azure Functions, so it does not have the Azure Functions core tools to run the applications. So typically, when you have a new developer laptop, what you would do is you would go to the Azure Functions core tools and you quickly install them. You can do in our code space as well. You can say, I allow copy pasting here. Just start doing npm install of the Azure Functions core tools. So note that all of this is happening in our cloud-based environment. Okay. So we're npm installing, and if we now do an npm start, we start our APIs, it starts the Azure Functions core tools, and we actually get two, basically we get two APIs. We have a get to get some data, and we can actually post some updates to actually post an order for our e-commerce shop. Now you might wonder, well, localhost, how do I get to localhost for a cloud-based environment? Now what Codespaces actually does, it actually does what is called port forwarding. So it's going to take this localhost address, which is actually pointing to something in a cloud-based environment on a virtual machine somewhere sitting in our data centers, and it's going to forward the port of this localhost to an address which is publicly accessible for me within my environment. Again, there is authentication, so not just anyone can connect to this kind of address within your application. So it is secured, but for you, I have a 503 services. Let me check again. What happened there? Let's see if we can get it to run. There we go. So what we get is some JSON results, and it's actually returning me some ice creams. We'll have different types of ice creams that are being returned from our catalog. You can see that we're calling into this localhost Azure Functions, and it's being returned, so I can actually browse to it through this forwarded URL specifically for my application. So all of this happens automatically. There's nothing I need to do as a developer to get this to work. And what's more, this application, so it's a Vue.js application, which will call into this API. If you want to do this, let's say I want to start the front end as well. So I'm going to the Vue.js application. Again, I'm doing an npm install. This should take just a couple of seconds. And the cool thing when running into when running in the cloud is that you get the bandwidth of the cloud as well to kind of pull all of the dependencies for your npm packages. And as we have quite a few for our Vue.js application, that's quite an advantage of rather than running it locally over my currently somewhat laggy internet connection. So we've done an npm install, and now we can do an npm run serve to run our front-end application. And there we can see that it is running over port 8080. And if we go there, again, we have forwarding that is happening. Click on that localhost address, and it should come up with basically authenticating again. And it should come up with our front-end application, which will call into our backend APIs. So there we go. We have our ice creams coming up, pulling in our Azure Functions, again, running on localhost. But everything is connected seamlessly because of all of the port forwarding that is happening automatically by GitHub Codespaces. But this is kind of cool. You really have an experience as if you were running on your local machine. So you have all of the code editing capabilities. So you can go into your actual code here. You will have IntelliSense available. You have color coding, whatever you need. All of the features of VS Code are available in this cloud-based environment. So that's kind of fun. Now, one thing you want to do as well is probably will be debugging this application as well. So in the same way that we have the other experiences, we can set breakpoints here. So in our Azure function, we can set breakpoints. And if I do an F5, to start the application, F5 can run my Azure functions in debug mode. There we go. And if we now go to, so I've set the breakpoint here in our get catalog. If we now go to our link and we invoke our API, as you can see here already, you can see the red little circle there. It's actually now waiting on this specific line here. So we can step over this one to get our catalog. So this will retrieve the data. And if you then look at items, we can actually get in the same way again. We have all of the data. We can have the watch variables, whatever you're used to in debugging with VS Code, you have here as well. So debugging your extensions that you can install, whatever you're familiar with, you can still continue to do. You have your local hosts. So all of that is pretty nice. Okay, so stopping this debugging there. Now, maybe, well, all of this is cool, but maybe you want to use Visual Studio Code on your local machine as well. Maybe you don't want to do everything within the browser, and you're used to kind of using Visual Studio Code on your local machine. So if I now switch to VS Code on my machine there, the one thing you can do is you can also connect to an existing code space, which is running in the cloud from your local Visual Studio Code kind of editor. So what happens there, if we, so what you'll need for this is you'll need to install an extension. If you go to our extensions and we search for GitHub Codespaces, there, if you install this one, what you'll get is, if you go to the Remote Explorer, and we just refresh here, we have a Remote Explorer. It's connecting to our GitHub Codespaces, and we can actually see that we have here an active Codespace. You can also create a new Codespace if you want to, or what you can do as well is right-click on this one and say, I want to open this Codespace in a new window. Okay, so if I do this, it will open up a new VS Code window. It will connect it to my you see here at the bottom, it's opening my remote, making the remote connection. It's going to connect to this same GitHub Codespace, and it will give me that same experience, that same development experience as I had in the browser, but now straight from my local Visual Studio Code environment. So as you can see here, my code editor is running locally. However, all of the code that you see here, so I have this API, I have this View app, all of this is sitting in my cloud-hosted environment. Okay. So, for example, if I open up a terminal window, see here that we have, if I do a new name, we can actually see that I'm running in a Linux codespace OS. This is not running on my local machine. This is really connected to this cloud-hosted environment. And so in the same way, I can go to the API folder, I can do an npm start, and it will do the exact same functionality. Again, I'll have localhost, but again, localhost is not my localhost, not on my machine, not on my laptop here. Again, it's being forwarded because this localhost that you see in this terminal window is actually connected to this hosted environment. So again, you can see this one here as if it were running on my local machine. However, it is forwarded to this cloud-hosted environment. So that's pretty neat actually to work with. And again, whatever you do in here, it's all part of this cloud-hosted environment. So you can connect from anywhere you are to this cloud hosted environment. So this gets you started pretty quickly with either an open source project or your own source code repository. However, there's one thing which we kind of quickly stepped over, which was that, well, for my specific project, I had to install these Azure Functions core tools because they are part of my project. To be able to run this application, I need to install these Azure Functions core tools. That's something that you need to know. I have to read up and say, or I just discover it as I start the APIs. It just fails for some reason because it's missing some dependency. And so what we can do with Codespaces is actually create a Codespace that has all of that configuration already specifically configured for my specific repository. So for my specific repository, I would want the Azure Functions core tools to be installed as soon as you connect to your Codespace, which is currently not the case. So we're using just the default kind of Codespace environment, which has a number of tools, but it doesn't have everything yet. And so how do we actually pre-configure our Codespace to be able to get it set up for our repository? And so what we're going to do is we're going to going back to our Codespaces here. And I can close this one now. Come back here. Oh yeah, probably I should. So what we'll do is let me connect again to this one. So what we'll do, sorry for a little confusion there. So what we'll do is we'll configure our repository to actually contain what is called a developer container, a dev container configuration. So it's opening up again in this code. And so what happens here on the bottom left, you can see Codespaces here. If you click on this one, you can actually see add development container configuration files. So that's what we're going to do now. If I click on this one, it's asking me what type of container configuration do you want? Are you using just Node.js? Is it maybe straight Ubuntu rather than kind of the default Codespaces image that you want to use? Or I can actually show all definitions. And here you can actually see a full list of different types of code environments. And you can create your own environments as well. So this is coming from a GitHub repository where we have kind of a whole list of templates. So if you want to do Kubernetes development, if you're doing something with Azure blockchain, etc., there are kind of already pre-baked templates and developer containers for you. And so what we're going to do is, as we are using Azure Static Web Apps, I'm going to pick this one. So as we do this, what happens is you can see a folder being added to our project, which is called it has a .dev container, and what is in there? It has a JSON configuration file, and it has a Docker file in it. There. This JSON file. What is actually now happening here? What's in there? So in this configuration of our kind of GitHub Codespaces developer container, it has a definition of what ports do you want to have configured to be forwarded. In our specific case, our application, our front-end application is hosted on port 8080, so let's change that one. And our API is hosted on port 7071, we can keep that one. You want to use the bash shell as a setting, but you can put any specific Visual Studio Code setting in there that you want to have predefined for you. And then you will have a number of extensions here as well. So we have Azure Functions, we have Azure Static Web Apps, etc., etc. We have some additional kind of extensions to be added, and maybe you want to execute some commands whenever the Codespace is being created. So this kind of defines what your Codespace should look like. And as you can see here, it has here the Docker file parameter specified as well. If we take a look at this Docker file, what you'll see is it's actually using a Docker file which is based on Azure Functions. So because of that, the Azure Functions core tools will be already integrated in this template, in this GitHub Codespace. So as we start then our Codespace, it's going to use this specific Docker image and spin it up, and it will configure our kind of development environment with all of these extensions. Now, one thing to note here in this template, there's a small bug, and this is kind of a nice opportunity to do a pull request for this specific template. Is one extension that is missing is actually the extension for, and let me take that one, for actually Azure account extension. I'm just going to copy paste this one, not to make any typos. Here, paste this one. Because there is a dependency for Azure Functions on the Azure account extension. We're going to add this one. Okay, so now we've just added our developer container configuration. So what we can do now is we can check in on commit all our changes. So that container for static web apps. So commit this one, and we're going to sync it to GitHub repository. Okay. So now, now that we've done this, let's come back to our come back to this one here. Go to our repo, and I need to come back here and GitHub repository. There we go. Fresh, it should show that we have updated now the dev container. My internet seems to be very laggy. Okay, so we have our dev container now in there. But what we can do is we can, in our Codespace, well, let's delete this one first, and let's create a new one. To create a new one, it's going to use our local dev container configuration now. It's opening it up again in Codespaces. And what we should see now is that we should have the same developer experience, so our Visual Studio Code in the browser still continue to work. But now the Azure Functions core tools should be already pre-installed in our developer environment. So rather than having to install them explicitly ourselves, we should be able to do an npm install and then just do an npm start to kind of get started with the APIs. So this takes a little bit longer, should take like another like 20 seconds to build the container. So it's taking that Docker file that we specified in our dev container.json file, and it's going to create a container based on that Docker file. And then it's going to spin it up and actually get it connected to our VS Code in the browser. Let me quickly check if there's any questions so far. Yes. Oh, there's a question. Okay, about editors. Yes. Let's not go into that discussion on what is the best editor. I guess we all have our preferences. And let's say that Emacs is not my preference. Okay, so we're up and running here again. And let's go back to our terminal. And let's see if we do the API. API folder. Okay, so now we should be able to do an install for API. There we go. And if we do now an API start, I hope nothing went wrong with the configuration. We are still using our Codespaces Azure, so something went wrong with that dev container configuration. well, I guess you'll have to trust me for that one. Time. But basically what happens is, as you specify your dev container, I guess probably I had a typo somewhere. It will come pre-configured for your developer environment, for your specific repo, so that you don't need to kind of go through all of the configuration and settings for your specific project. So we're currently in beta. So in terms of pricing, it's currently free. As we go into general availability, there's basically kind of two components. Basically, you're paying per hour rate for the compute, so for the virtual machines that you're running on is what you're paying for, as well as a small fee for the actual storage. Now, a number of resources, the link to actually join the beta, to get actually the list of pre-built containers, as well as the documentation for GitHub Codespaces to actually get started. So definitely make sure that you join the beta and play with Codespaces if you haven't yet. Really looking forward to your feedback, and I want to open it up for questions.